William Pokhlyobkin had always been a man consumed by passion, a passion for food, history, and the intersection between them. As a child in the Russian countryside, he had watched his grandmother prepare meals that were rich in tradition, passed down through generations. It was those early experiences that led him to a lifelong obsession with Russian cuisine. By the time he reached his 70s, he had become the foremost expert in the field, an authority whose knowledge of the history of Russian food was unmatched. Pokhlyobkin was a prolific author, having written numerous books about the evolution of Russian culinary traditions. His magnum opus, Cuisine of the Century, was on the brink of completion, a comprehensive exploration of how food had shaped Russian culture throughout the 20th century. It was a book he had poured his heart into for years, meticulously gathering research, recipes, and anecdotes from a tumultuous period in Russian history. He lived alone in a small, unassuming apartment in Podolsk, a town just outside Moscow. Despite his fame in culinary circles, Pokhlyobkin was not the type to enjoy the trappings of a public life. His life was quiet, simple, and solitary. He spent his days at his desk, surrounded by piles of manuscripts, books, and cooking utensils. Every evening, he would prepare a meal, often trying out recipes he had written about in his books, savoring the flavors and reflecting on how the food of Russia had evolved. But in the spring of 2000, as the last chapters of Cuisine of the Century were being finalized, something went terribly wrong. On the morning of March 31st, the chief editor of the Polyvac publishing house, Sergei Ivanov, arrived in Podolsk. He had become increasingly concerned about the delay of the book. It had been weeks since he last received any correspondence from Pokhlyobkin, and with the manuscript nearing completion, Sergei grew worried. He was no stranger to the eccentricities of authors, but Pokhlyobkin's absence was more than just a sign of creative frustration. Something felt off. Sergei had made the trip to Podolsk to visit the reclusive author, hoping to understand what had caused the delay. As he approached Pokhlyobkin's apartment building, he could sense the familiar hum of quiet suburban life, children playing in the street, the distant sound of passing cars. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but as he reached the door of Pokhlyobkin's apartment and knocked, a sense of unease began to settle over him. When there was no answer, Sergei used his spare key to enter. What he found inside was a scene he would never forget. The apartment was exactly as he had imagined, books scattered across the floor, pages of handwritten notes everywhere, the smell of old paper and spices lingering in the air. But as he stepped further inside, the sight that greeted him made his heart stop. William Pokhlyobkin was lying motionless on the floor of his small living room, his once neat and orderly appearance now disheveled and covered in blood. The body was cold, the eyes open but lifeless, a chilling sign that the murder had taken place days earlier. Sergei quickly realized that Pokhlyobkin had been murdered, his death occurring sometime between March 27 and March 31. The peculiar stillness in the apartment suggested the killer had known how to avoid leaving a trace, making it clear that this was not an act of random violence. Sergei immediately called the authorities, his mind racing with questions. Who would want to harm a man like William Pokhlyobkin? What could have prompted such an extreme act against someone who had dedicated his life to the history of food? The police arrived quickly, but the investigation seemed to hit dead ends. There was no sign of forced entry, no obvious motive, and little to point to any suspect. However, one detail stood out. On Pokhlyobkin's desk, alongside the incomplete manuscript of Cuisine of the Century, was a collection of strange, anonymous letters that seemed to suggest the author had been under some kind of threat. The letters, written in an elegant script, contained cryptic warnings, urging Pokhlyobkin to stop his work on the book. Some were filled with hostile language, accusing him of misrepresenting Russian history, while others seemed to imply that certain people did not want the truth about Russia's culinary history to be known. Some of the letters contained veiled threats about the potential consequences of exposing too much. Pokhlyobkin had often been vocal about his stance on the misrepresentation of Russian cuisine during certain periods of history. He was particularly critical of Soviet-era culinary practices, which he believed had been stripped of tradition in favor of state-controlled efficiency. His writings had earned him admirers, but also enemies, those who felt that he was undermining the official narrative or revealing uncomfortable truths about the state of Russian food culture under the Soviet regime. As the investigation unfolded, suspicions grew that Pokhlyobkin's death might have been linked to his controversial research. His sharp critiques of Soviet-era food policies and the figures who had shaped the country's culinary identity had likely earned him a number of adversaries, some with the power to silence him. However, despite these suspicions, no direct connections could be made between the letters and any specific group or individual. The police continued to investigate, but with each passing day, the case seemed to grow colder. No one was ever arrested for William Pokhlyobkin's murder, and his death remained a tragic mystery. Some speculated that his work had made him an inconvenient figure for those who sought to keep certain aspects of history buried, while others believed that his quiet life had inadvertently attracted a dangerous enemy, someone who had no interest in being exposed. In the months following Pokhlyobkin's death, Cuisine of the Century was eventually published, though it was a bittersweet release. Sergei Ivanov, who had worked closely with Pokhlyobkin for many years, saw to it that the manuscript was completed and honored the author's legacy. The book was well received, though it always carried the shadow of tragedy. Pokhlyobkin's name became a symbol of the fragility of truth, and the price that sometimes had to be paid for revealing it. Years later, the memory of William Pokhlyobkin would live on, not only as the foremost authority on Russian cuisine, but as a man who had been silenced in the pursuit of preserving the richness of his country's culinary heritage. His death, shrouded in mystery, would remain a testament to the idea that some truths are too powerful to be revealed without consequences, and some questions remain unanswered.